in context and in conversation with the peers at that time and with the environment and what's going on in the culture at that time. But the other part of that is, as long as I feel as if I've done the research and the work, I feel like I can tie into that voice. I'm a child who, as a child, I was always listening to adults talking because there was a musicality to the way that they would curse, the way that they would tell stories, and as I got older, I became more enamored with those stories and with that musicality to the point where my maternal grandmother passed away last July. I spent the last 3 years of her life recording conversations with her. And she passed away a little bit before her 92nd birthday. So she had a lot of information telling me about working the counters in Arkansas when they were, protesting in the counters, and just, her thoughts on Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King and what it was like growing up, and being poor and after the depression. It's like there was so much that she had, and I recognized that. And I always had a great relationship with my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, and my maternal grandmother. So I was always getting stories from them too. And so that helps me. And it helps ground me, and it helps me realize in many ways I'm vocalizing issues and thoughts and emotions for people who did not have opportunities and avenues to say something before. And so I'm in awe of the ability to be able to do that. I recognize the responsibility I have in doing that, and I again ensure that I'm doing it as responsible as I can. I'm responsible as I can in doing it. So there's that. And actually, the funny thing about that is that dovetails in. I was looking for a poem. In my first book, I read when I went to BCCA, and I had a moment with this book by Deborah C. Willis called A Photographic History of the Black Female Body, right? And this was a book that when I was producing, I used to be a producer for the Kojo Nnamdi show, and it came through, and I was just like, oh my gosh, like, we can do a show on this, but I'm also just holding on to this book, because I would like to have some time with this book. And so finally, when I got a chance to go away, I took that book with me, and in reading that entire book, I spent like the first 3 days just reading that book and staying in that world and letting my anger and letting my hurt simmer and just simmer until I wrote a persona piece in response to a photograph that was in that book. And the photograph is called Untitled. It's a boudoir scene of a nude white woman and her naked black maid from the 1850s by Félix Jacques Moulin. So I'll just read that really quickly because it kind of makes sense. Because when you talk about that, I worked really hard to think about how can I get this voice right? And what would this woman say? Looking at her face. And then that was the other part, is using clues that I've just honed over time. There's a face that woman had that I've seen in my grandmother, in my great aunts, in my cousin, in my sisters, in my mother's face. I've seen that look, and it was just like, you could just get to that. And so that was what I tried to do with this poem, and it's called Odalisque. He asked her, up on this couch, please. Leopard skin under her bottom like she knows something of it. Tell me, take off your dress, sit here. See these breasts, how they hang? Used by they babies, not mine. These shoulders sagging so low. I work all damn day now this. She done snuck her leg under mine. Snake, you bleed like I bleed, but we ain't friends. We ain't sisters. You smile for his camera. I'm here 'cause it's my job. You take this picture, make me sit behind you, prop like that leopard skin, and you sit coy-like, pretty-like. We ain't sisters, we ain't friends. Just tell me when I can get up and put my dress back on. Be done with your foolishness. White woman, smile now. They all want you until they don't.
So Holly, I'm gonna pass the mic to you, but just really briefly add what I'm fascinated, Terry, by. Obviously, just because someone is, say, African American, I think you beautifully articulated for me the idea that as a poet, as a writer, you still have to earn that voice. So there's so many layers of authenticity, and I think any honest writer grapples with that regardless of the subject matter. But when it's lit with historical issues of oppression and horror, I think it takes on orders of magnitude. And I know that's a perfect segue because I know that's a topic and a theme that you are particularly concerned with, Holly.
Yes. For me, race is always personal and it's always historical. People say the past is past, it's not. And if there's anything the past 3 years have shown us, it's that the past is really not past. So I'm going to read a couple of poems that are personal and historical. And for me, it's really hard to write about race without historical context. And this is a poem called There's Only Now. And it has an epigraph from Dylan Roof, who was the young man who shot the African Americans in the church in Charleston. My parents live in Charleston. So it was an event that hit me really hard. And it's also referencing, I don't know if you all know the website No Sanctuary, or Without Sanctuaries, it's called. It's with the lynching photos. It's a website where you can see a variety of lynching postcards and photos. And the most horrible thing in those photos is, for me, as a white person looking at them, of course, is the atrocity that's been done to black bodies and then usually black bodies. But it's also the sort of white faces around watching, oftentimes almost celebratory. So this is a poem that kind of references those images. There is only now. We are told to accept what is happening to us because of ancestors' wrongdoing, but it is all based on historical lies, exaggerations, and myths. Dylan Roof. Nothing happened. I was there. I was not there. The body swung like a pitchfork. The bodies hung like lanterns from the bridge. Their mouths were stuffed with rags. This never happened. This still happens every time I cross the bridge, black bodies swaying above the water, white bodies crowding on the bridge, looking down to see. Am I more afraid of a corpse or my shadow? My shadow or my hands, the blind spot, the rope pulling, and those white bodies looking down, their faces blurred against the background like ghosts. It's a heavy history, and I don't know. Should I talk a little bit about my history?
Sure.
I can. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, in a pretty racist white neighborhood, but I was fortunate to be in a school that participated in a busing program, M to M, majority to minority. Natasha Trethewey was part of this busing system. It's a point of pride for me that we were both part of this. So I had the opportunity to be in school with a lot of African American children. And so I was able to realize at an early age that a lot of the myths and narratives that I was being told by my white surroundings were not true. And I was able to form friendships with black children. And so I think I knew, I was troubled by race and whiteness for a very long time. I didn't start writing about it for many years because as a white person, whenever you talk about race, you're gonna get it wrong because there's just so much that you don't understand. And so I think I was always afraid of doing harm by taking on race in my poetry. And also, you want there to be a space for voices of color. Like, you don't want the white voices to dominate everything. They dominate pretty much everything in the publishing world. At least there's, some topics that maybe should be, white writers should be silent on. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this is a conversation that we as white people need to be having too. It's not the responsibility of people of color to keep educating us and to keep bringing up these topics and to keep having this conversation. this is all of our problem. And I also started to own my own trauma as a white person, being traumatized by whiteness, being traumatized by race, and in ways that are obviously, not as physically harmful or dangerous, and also not as troubling as for people of color, but nevertheless are psychologically traumatizing. Whiteness is a real ugliness, and it's ugly for all of us. And one of my, because I do a lot of research too, I just, as I started writing about race, I just kept going back and back in history, and I just kind of became obsessed with slavery as this sort of horrific example of what we're capable of in our darkest moments as human beings. And one of the quotes that stays with me is from the American Slave Project, and it's a slave recalling his slave master, his master, saying to his 2 young sons, "Go down there to the quarters and get me more slaves." So he was telling his 2 young teenage sons to go and rape his female slaves to get more property. And I have a teenage son, and I think what would it be like to live in that kind of world? And we're still, in many respects, in that world. So I think it's harmful to us too, as white people. So I write out of a place of my own trauma and my own experiences, and I think that's sort of how I was able to start the conversation.
Thanks, Holly. So I mentioned earlier that the notion of writing kind of inherently is an act of bearing witness, and I think with poetry in particular, we have a rich history cutting across cultures of bearing witness, particularly to things we say should or will never happen again, and what these poems commemorate and unfortunately bring to light is that we always do it again. I come to a recent project, having been a grad student, I was neck deep in cultural studies and the idea of interrogating, and that there's no one voice and there's no one story. And I also had an impulse as a writer and as a fan to celebrate these heroes of art and life and the world. And for me, I was able to scratch that itch for many years as a critic, writing a lot about jazz musicians, jazz music, and it was satisfying in its way, just like writing about politics is satisfying, but it doesn't have much of a shelf life. And for me, I think it was a lifetime of experience and this anger and this wanting to bear witness and celebrate and lend my own perspective that I realized poetry was a way of doing this that was much more personal and perhaps more poignant than the most eloquent essay about a particular musician. So I'd like to read a couple of poems from a project I'm working on. I had 3 poems. 3 of these were published in a wonderful literary magazine called Sequestrum. And they asked me to explain, and I'll briefly say, most of these poems are celebrating personal heroes who remain far less celebrated in our culture than they deserve to be. And they're all musicians, and they were all hampered in various ways by discrimination, ranging from plain old-fashioned racism to institutional and cultural indifference. They fought their battles bravely in their art and in their lives. There's an elegiac sadness suffusing these pieces, but also an attempt to acknowledge this defiant genius that they all shared. So the first one is called Billie Holiday's Deathbed. And it starts with a factual anecdote, which is on May 31st, 1959, as she lay dying at the Metropolitan Hospital